Late afternoon light stretched low across the dirt track, the sun slanting through thin acacia shadows and scattering gold across the baked earth. The air was still except for the faint scrape of Leah's boots on gravel, a sound so familiar it nearly blended into the hum of the day. She might have passed straight through the bend if not for a thread of sound that broke the stillness. A soft, uneven cry, too faint for a bird, too insistent for an insect. She stopped, letting the dust settle at her feet, and turned her head slightly to listen again. The sound came in bursts, followed by silence, as though the source needed to gather strength before each call. Following the noise, she stepped off the track toward a patch of low thorn bush. There, half hidden in the dappled light, sat something unnatural against the earth, a sagging cardboard box. Its edges were warped, corners softened by dampness long since dried. A torn seam gaped along one side, and the faint smell of old, stale air drifted out. She crouched slowly, one knee pressing into the dirt, and tilted her head. The cry came again, sharper now, with a faint rasp that told her it was not simply distress, it was effort, struggle. Leah's hands moved carefully, lifting one of the box's flaps. Inside, in a shallow hollow lined with dust, lay a lion cub no bigger than a house cat. His coat, meant to be a soft, sunlit gold, was dulled and patchy with grit. Each rib stood out beneath the skin, rising and falling with a shallow rhythm that looked fragile enough to break. His eyes, barely open, held no alertness, only the sluggish flutter of lids that fought to stay lifted. He tried to raise his head, but it wavered mid-air and fell back with a faint tap against the cardboard wall. For a moment he simply lay still, whiskers twitching irregularly. A thin trail of saliva clung to the side of his mouth. His paws, curled loosely under his body, were raw at the pads, as though he had scraped them against the box in earlier hours, trying to escape. Leah slid her hands under him, feeling the unnatural lightness, the limp looseness of a body that had been without proper nourishment for too long. He was warm, but not enough. The warmth of a healthy cub should be full and constant. This was fading, seeping away even as she held him. As she lifted him, the cub made a soft, broken sound, part whimper, part cough, that caught halfway in his throat. "Easy now," she murmured, her voice low, a steady current in the still air. She tucked him against her chest, pressing the side of his head into the fabric of her shirt to shield his eyes from the sun and his body from the cooling breeze. She could feel the shallow press of his ribs with each breath, the fragile, erratic beat of his heart against her arm. The station was nearly a kilometer away, a distance that had never felt long until now. Every step back along the track carried a calculation. If she moved too quickly, she risked jostling him, wasting what little energy he had left. If she went too slowly, the fading warmth in her arms might be the last he ever held. His survival balanced in the small space between urgency and gentleness. Halfway there, Leah noticed the changes. The cub's breathing grew quieter, shallower, his chest rising only enough to shift the fabric against him. His head rested heavily in the crook of her elbow, unmoving except for the smallest twitch of an ear when a bird called from somewhere ahead. His tail, which had given a weak flick earlier, now lay still. She kept glancing down, measuring the rise and fall of his flank with each step, looking for signs that the pattern was breaking. If it stopped, there would be nothing she could do on the track. A dust devil crossed the path ahead, spiraling briefly before collapsing into nothing. Leah's boots passed through the faint ring it left, the air there slightly cooler. The cub didn't stir. She adjusted her hold, slipping one hand higher to cup his body, trying to keep him as still and supported as possible. The pads of his paws, rough against her fingers, were cold now. She pressed them gently against her forearm, trying to transfer heat. The sound of the station was still out of reach. No generator hum, no faint voices. Only the low rustle of dry leaves in the breeze. She counted the remaining bends in the track, each one bringing them closer, each one feeling longer than the last. His heartbeat against her arm was faint and irregular, sometimes slowing so much she found herself holding her breath to hear it again. She murmured once more, not with words meant to comfort, but simply to keep her own pace steady. Near the last stretch, the cub's cries began again. Small, dry sounds, weaker than before, each one ending in a rasping breath. To Leah, the cries were both relief and warning. Relief that he still had the strength to call, and warning that it was running out. She tightened her grip just slightly, careful not to press against his fragile ribs, and quickened her step on the smoother ground. The station's outline came into view. Low buildings against the fading light, a thin column of smoke curling from the kitchen fire. Somewhere inside, there would be warm blankets, formula, the quiet hum of a small heater, things that might tip the balance in his favor. She crossed the compound threshold, the sound of the cubs breathing louder now in the still air. Every second counted. If they acted quickly, he might see the next sunrise. If they delayed, he would not. Leah adjusted her grip as she stepped away from the roadside, the cub's body resting almost weightless in her hands. His fur was thin under her palms, the bones of his shoulders pressing against her skin with every shallow breath. His head lolled slightly, chin brushing her wrist, and each time she shifted him to keep his airway clear, a faint, broken sound escaped his throat. It was not a full cry anymore, more a fragile rasp, as if even calling out took more than he could spare. His ribs lifted and fell in small, uneven movements, the effort visible in the way his nostrils flared and his mouth parted to take in air. She drew him closer to her chest, trying to keep his body aligned so he wouldn't strain against himself. Her steps were slow at first, careful not to jolt him, but with every passing moment the knowledge pressed harder. Time was not on their side. If he cooled too much before reaching the station, his system could fail entirely. Yet rushing could undo what little stability she had managed by holding him still. Each stride became a measured choice, a balance between speed and steadiness. The ground beneath her alternated between loose sand and firm earth, each change felt in the way his weight shifted against her. A warm breeze moved through the low grass beside the track, bending the brittle stems, but it brought no comfort. The cub's small body remained tense in places, his paws curled inwards, claws just grazing her forearm. The pads were rough and cracked, each one a sign that he had been left in confinement for too long. Occasionally, a twitch passed through his hind legs, a sudden short movement that stilled almost as quickly as it began. She glanced down each time, watching his flank for the regular rise and fall that meant he was still fighting. The road back seemed to stretch further than she remembered. Landmarks she knew well, the split in the path where an old tire lay half buried, the twisted fence post leaning toward the track, passed slowly, their familiar shapes offering no comfort. Each step felt heavier. Not because of the cub's weight, but because of how little of it there was. In healthy condition, a lion cub this age would carry a fullness to its frame, a steady warmth, and a certain resistance when held. This one felt insubstantial, as if the air in her arms might outweigh him. Halfway along, the cub stirred weakly, lifting his head for a moment before letting it fall back. The movement brought a faint gasp from him, followed by 2 shallow breaths in quick succession. Leah slowed her pace, adjusting her hold so that his chest remained supported and his neck straight. She could feel the thin pulse at the base of his throat, uneven and slow. "Stay with me," she said softly, the words more rhythm than meaning, a quiet line to match the beat of her steps. The sun slid lower, shadows lengthening over the path, and she imagined the drop in temperature that would soon come. Cubs lost heat far faster than adults, and in his condition, even a few degrees could push him beyond recovery. Every time she felt his warmth slip a little more, she pressed him closer, sheltering him from the breeze. The fabric of her shirt absorbed what heat remained, and she hoped her own body's warmth was enough to bridge the distance ahead. The compound's fence was still not in sight, and the risk lingered in every thought. If he grew too weak to swallow, even the first feed might not help. If his breathing worsened, he might not survive the examination. If his temperature dropped too far before arrival, the rest would not matter. She kept walking, each risk repeating in her mind like a set of facts that could not be ignored. As she neared a shallow dip in the track, a stone shifted underfoot, and she instinctively tightened her grip. The cub made a low, muffled noise, not quite a cry, more an acknowledgement of discomfort. She steadied her footing, waited for his breathing to settle again, then continued. His tail gave the smallest flick, brushing against her side before stilling once more. She counted 3 slow breaths, then 4, then waited for the next, each one a measure of the time they had left. When the track finally began to slope upward toward the station, the faint outline of the buildings came into view. Relief was tempered by the knowledge that the most critical minutes were still ahead, minutes where any change could alter the outcome. She shifted her arms slightly, feeling his chest expand under her hand. Each breath drawn with visible effort. The distance between them and the first door felt impossibly long. She kept her pace steady, not daring to falter, knowing that once inside, every moment would decide whether the cub would live through the night. Leah moved quickly but without haste through the gates of the outpost, her boots striking a steady rhythm on the packed earth. The small rescue station sat quiet in the late light, its walls warmed by the sun but shadowed at the edges where evening began to settle. She stepped into the treatment room, a narrow space that smelt faintly of disinfectant and clean cloth, and found Daniel and Amina already clearing the examination table. The cub's body felt unnaturally light in her arms as she transferred him to the smooth surface, her hands remaining a moment longer on his side before she stepped back just enough to let the others see. In the softer light indoors, there was no hiding what the roadside dust had only hinted at. His fur, once meant to carry the rich sandy gold of his species, was dulled to a muted tan, clumped in places with dirt and dried fluid. The contours of his skull were too sharply defined, his cheeks hollow where there should have been a gentle fullness. His eyes remained half-lidded and unfocused, the inner corners crusted with residue from prolonged discharge. His breathing was barely visible beneath the ridges of his ribs. Each inhale shallow, each exhale uneven, as if air itself had become heavy for him to carry. Daniel began with the scale. The cub's weight registered far below the expected range for his age. Even before reading the number, the absence of healthy resistance in his limbs had told them enough. His muscles had reduced to narrow bands, his legs little more than bone wrapped in thin skin. Leah's gaze fell to his paws, and the damage there spoke of long confinement. The pads were raw, reddened, and cracked, as though he had scraped them again and again against a rough surface. The faint smear of dried blood around the edges suggested the friction had continued until he no longer had the strength to persist. When Daniel's fingers brushed one forepaw, the cub's body tightened in a brief, reflexive recoil before settling back into stillness. Amina pinched the skin gently along his flank, watching it lift easily and remain tented for long seconds before returning. The slow response confirmed severe dehydration. She reached for a prepared solution, water mixed with electrolytes, and began the slow process of offering it at the corner of his mouth. The cub's first reaction was none at all, his lips dry and unmoving. Only after several moments did his tongue shift weakly, accepting a drop. A swallow followed, shallow but real. They waited, letting him rest before offering the next, aware that too much too soon could overwhelm his fragile system. Daniel listened to his chest through the stethoscope, his face set in quiet concentration. The report was factual. A heartbeat irregular in rhythm, a faint wheeze beneath each inhalation, and lungs that sounded shallow but not yet collapsed. The absence of visible injuries beyond the paws was noted, but no one mistook that for safety. Malnutrition and dehydration weakened every system, and even a mild infection could tip the balance. His tail lay slack against the table, unmoving except for the occasional faint tremor near the tip when he swallowed. The room remained steady in its silence, broken only by soft, purposeful exchanges. requests for a warmed blanket, a check of the thermometer, a note added to the logbook. No movements were rushed. Leah stepped aside to retrieve a thin fleece warmed beside the small heater in the corner, folding it loosely before lowering it over the cub. The heat seemed to reach him. One ear twitched. A tiny acknowledgement of change before returning to stillness. She rested her hand lightly over the blanket, feeling the slow thud of his heart beneath. They decided to record him under a name: Sorrow. The choice was made without sentiment, simply as a practical identifier for his chart and care schedule. In the log, Leah wrote the details in clear, precise script: weight, hydration status, heart rate, respiratory quality, the condition of the paws, and behavioral notes. These were the baseline from which every change, improvement, or decline would be measured. She wrote them knowing that in cases like this the line between either outcome could be as fine as a single hour's shift. Each risk was stated plainly as procedure demanded. If Sorrow failed to retain fluids, his decline would be rapid. If his breathing deteriorated overnight, options for intervention were limited, and stress from handling could worsen his state. If infection took hold in the open abrasions on his paws, it could spread quickly in his weakened body. The facts were spoken without emphasis, but they carried weight in the way every movement around the table grew even more deliberate. Leah adjusted the blanket so it formed a pocket of warmth around him, tucking it beneath his body without pressing too firmly. His eyes opened fractionally then, a dull amber glint visible for a moment before the lids slid closed again. It was noted, just another observation in the sequence they would track, but no one mistook it for recovery. She positioned the low, steady heat source at the end of the table, ensuring the air reached him without blowing directly across his face. With the first steps complete, they dimmed the overhead light to ease strain on his eyes and left the blanket in place. Leah kept her hand resting on him a moment longer, feeling the slight rhythm of his breathing and the faint warmth returning beneath her palm. Sorrow's stability was real, but fragile, the kind that could shift without warning. Until the next check, the best they could give him was warmth, quiet, and the absence of unnecessary disturbance. Outside, the sky was taking on the muted colors of early evening, and through the narrow window a band of gold stretched across the table. It fell over the edge of the blanket, tracing the outline of the small form beneath. Sorrow lay unmoving, each breath a small, precise effort, the weight of his neglect still pressing on every part of him. Whether he would survive the night was a question none could yet answer, but for now the box was gone, and he was no longer unseen. The heater in the corner hummed at a steady, low pitch, its warmth barely reaching the edge of the table where Sorrow lay wrapped in the fleece. Leah sat close, one hand lightly over his side to feel the rhythm of his breathing, the other cradling a small syringe of milk replacer mixed with the rehydration formula. Every hour she offered him only a few milliliters at a time, allowing long pauses between each to keep him from tiring. The liquid pooled briefly at the corner of his mouth before he swallowed, the movement subtle but deliberate. She waited after every few drops, watching his flank for the rise and fall that confirmed he was still managing to breathe without strain. Each successful swallow was a small gain. Each delay in the next breath reminded her how quickly that balance could be lost. From time to time, she unwrapped him enough to gently rub his limbs, working her fingers along the narrow length of his legs to encourage circulation. His paws twitched faintly under her touch, the pads still rough and reddened from their earlier injury. The warmth from her hands seemed to settle him, though the change was slight, a lessening of tension in his shoulders, a small release in the curl of his tail. These signs were not progress in any real sense, but they told her his body was still responding to care. That mattered. Without constant warmth and stimulation, his temperature could drop further and recovery would become nearly impossible. The night outside pressed close against the single window, the compound quiet except for the occasional call of a nightjar in the distance. Leah kept her focus on the narrow set of tasks that could make a difference: warmth, fluids, circulation, and rest. When Sorrow shifted suddenly and let out a thin, rasping cry, she steadied him, murmuring, "It's all right," in a low, even tone before resettling the blanket. The sound of his cry was not strength. It was a reminder that discomfort still lived in him, but it was also proof he had the energy to express it. That, too, had to be counted as something. Hours passed in fragments, measured by the intervals between his feedings and the regular checks of his body temperature. The heater's steady warmth kept the fleece comfortably warm to the touch, but his core heat remained only just within a survivable range. Every so often he would slip into a deeper stillness, his breaths slow and quiet. Leah would wait through each pause, counting, ready to stimulate him again if the space between breaths stretched too far. These moments carried the most weight. If his breathing faltered entirely, there would be nothing she could do here to bring it back. When the air in the room cooled in the early hours before dawn, she adjusted the blanket again and drew him closer to her own body, letting her warmth fill the space between. His ears flicked once at the change, a small sign that he registered the contact. She continued the routine: minute amounts of fluid, slow limb massages, constant monitoring of his breathing, knowing that any lapse could tip him past recovery. At this stage, stability was not a steady state, but a fragile line, easily broken by exhaustion, cold, or the simplest shift in his body's limited reserves. By the last stretch of night, his cries had quieted entirely, replaced by faint, irregular breaths. Each pause between them felt longer than it was. The silence pressing against her as she waited for the next small movement of his chest. The risks had not changed. If he survived to morning, it would be because he had held the line through these hours. If he did not, it would happen here, in the stillness that followed. Leah kept her hand on him, eyes fixed on the slow, shallow rhythm that was the only thing keeping him with them. A faint gray light began to seep into the room, touching the edges of the table and the folds of the fleece. The first call of a bird came from the scrub beyond the compound wall, low and distant. Sorrow remained still, his breathing quiet but present. Leah exhaled once, slow and silent, and kept her hand where it was, letting the warmth stay with him as the day began to arrive. The first light of morning reached the edges of the treatment room, filtering in pale and cool through the narrow window. Leah had not moved far from Sorrow all night, her chair drawn close so she could keep a steady hand resting on the small rise of his side. The air still carried the faint hum of the heater, and the fleece around him was warm to the touch. For long minutes after sunrise, his breathing remained the same, shallow, slow, and uneven. Then, without warning, he shifted. It was a small movement, just enough to press his forepaws against the blanket and lift his head an inch from the surface. The effort seemed to cost him, his neck trembling as he held it there before lowering it again, but it was the first clear sign of voluntary strength since he had arrived. Leah reached for the prepared syringe of milk replacer and rehydration mix. Overnight, he had taken only the smallest amounts, each swallow followed by long rests. Now she placed a drop at the edge of his mouth. His tongue moved almost immediately, catching the liquid before it could spill. She gave him a few more drops, watching his throat work to swallow them without pause. This time, the motion was stronger, less tentative. He took more before turning his head slightly away, a quiet indication that he needed to rest. She stopped at once, keeping to the careful balance. Too much too soon could leave him unable to keep it down, undoing any progress. Daniel entered quietly, checking the notes from the night. Leah explained the change in his feeding. Her voice even but edged with the knowledge that improvement did not yet mean safety. Sorrow's eyes opened wider than before, though still dulled by exhaustion. They flicked briefly toward the movement in the room, then settled again. That awareness, however slight, was another small sign the night's work had held him through the most dangerous hours. Daniel knelt to examine his paws, noting the same abrasions but also the faintest reduction in swelling. The blanket was adjusted to maintain warmth, keeping his thin body from losing heat while his system focused on recovery. The team exchanged a few brief glances, cautious, not celebratory. In rescues like this, early gains often faded as quickly as they appeared. Still, there was no denying the value of these changes. If he could keep fluids down through the morning without signs of distress or regurgitation, his chances would shift slightly toward survival. They agreed to space his next feeding to allow his body to process what it had taken in. In the meantime, Leah resumed gentle limb stimulation, her fingers tracing small circles along the muscles to encourage blood flow. His tail moved faintly at the contact, the twitch measured and slow but intentional. The room held its quiet rhythm, measured care, steady observation, and the occasional low exchange of facts. Outside, the compound began to stir, the muted sound of voices carrying from the yard. Here, inside, every movement remained deliberate. Sorrow's chest rose and fell with more consistency now, each breath just a fraction deeper than it had been in the early hours. Leah's eyes stayed fixed on that pattern, because in his condition, breathing alone was the most reliable measure of where he stood between life and loss. As the morning wore on, she offered another small feed. Again, he took it willingly, swallowing with less hesitation. She waited, watching his body language for signs of discomfort, tensing, turning away sharply, irregular breathing. None came. The formula stayed down. It was not yet enough to shift his condition toward recovery, but it was enough to buy him more hours, and in his state, hours were everything. The heater's warmth, the quiet of the room, and the slow intake of nourishment were holding him steady for now. When she stepped back slightly, the sunlight had moved higher on the wall, drawing a pale rectangle across the edge of the table. Sorrow lay with his head turned toward it, his body still wrapped in the fleece, eyes half open but steady. It was not strength in the full sense, but it was a moment of endurance, a sign that he was not yet ready to give in. The air outside shifted with a light breeze, rustling through the dry grass beyond the window. Inside, his breathing continued, measured and present, carrying him a little further into the day. By mid-afternoon, the steady rhythm Sorrow had managed through the morning began to change. At first it was subtle, slightly faster breaths, a faint tightening in his sides as he exhaled. Leah noticed it during a routine check, her hand resting on his flank to feel the pattern. Within an hour, the difference was clear. His breathing had grown shallow again, each inhale quick and effortful, the sound carrying a faint rasp that had not been there before. She leaned closer, listening for any irregularity in his chest, and heard the low, uneven wheeze that confirmed something more than exhaustion was at work. Daniel joined her at the table, the two of them watching Sorrow in stillness for a full minute before speaking. They kept their voices low, exchanging only the essential facts: his respiratory rate, the audible obstruction, and the likelihood of fluid in his airways. The signs pointed toward a respiratory infection, dangerous under any circumstances, but particularly in a cub whose reserves were already stripped away by hunger and dehydration. Without intervention, his oxygen levels would drop, and his weakened body might not have the strength to recover. Leah moved quickly but without suddenness, keeping her motions calm to avoid startling him. She adjusted his position slightly, elevating his head and chest to ease the strain on his lungs. His eyes opened briefly at the shift, dull but responsive, before sliding closed again. She prepared a course of antibiotics appropriate for his size, the dosage calculated to the gram. While Daniel steadied the cub, she administered the first injection, her other hand resting lightly along his spine to feel the faint tremor that passed through him. He made no sound, but his tail gave a brief flick before settling. The treatment would not bring immediate relief. The infection would take time to respond. In the meantime, their focus shifted to supportive care, keeping his airways clear, maintaining warmth, and ensuring he had enough hydration to help his body fight. Leah used a soft cloth to wipe the slight moisture from his nostrils, noting the thicker discharge that confirmed their diagnosis. She offered him a small amount of rehydration mix, watching closely for any sign of choking or refusal. He accepted a few swallows but turned his head soon after, the movement slow and deliberate. Pushing him to take more could risk aspiration, so she set the syringe aside. The risks now were layered. If the infection worsened before the antibiotics could take effect, his breathing could fail. If his appetite decreased further, his already low strength would drop beyond recovery. If his temperature spiked, it would drain the little energy his body still held. Each possibility was considered in turn, guiding every action the team took in those critical hours. They worked in silence except for the soft exchange of updates, adjusting the heater's placement, changing the blanket when it became damp with his shallow sweat, and timing his breaths against the slow tick of the wall clock. By late afternoon, the rasp in his breathing had deepened, though the rate had steadied. It was impossible to know yet whether this was a sign of the medication beginning to work, or simply the rhythm of the illness. Leah stayed close, her hand returning often to rest gently on his side, counting the rise and fall. The heater cast a soft heat over the table, and the fleece around him held it in, but his ears and paws still felt cooler than they should. She rubbed them slowly, coaxing warmth back into his limbs, feeling each small twitch of response. Outside, the compound sounds moved into the quieter tones of the day's end, but inside the treatment room, the hours held their own weight. Sorrow's breathing was the measure of the moment, each inhale and exhale a fragile step in the race against time they could not fully control. As the sun lowered and the light on the wall turned from white to gold, he lay still in the folds of the blanket, his chest lifting in small, determined movements. The air beyond the window stirred the dry grass, and its sound seemed to settle in the room, carrying with it the knowledge that the night ahead would be another test he might not survive. The night wore on with no sudden changes, only the slow, uneven rhythm of a battle that had begun to lean toward its end. Sorrow lay wrapped in the fleece, his body smaller now in the folds, each breath shallower than the last. The heater's low warmth covered him, but his paws felt cool against Leah's hand, the heat slipping from them faster than she could restore it. She kept her palm on his side, feeling for the movement that came less often now, the rise and fall interrupted by long pauses that made the seconds between seem stretched and fragile. Outside, the wind pressed gently at the walls, its sound carrying in through the narrow gap in the window frame. Every few minutes Leah offered a drop of fluid at the edge of his mouth, but the swallow that had been there in the morning was fading. His tongue no longer moved to meet it, and the liquid rested briefly before slipping away. She set the syringe aside and rubbed his foreleg slowly, coaxing circulation where little was left to give. His ears twitched faintly once, but there was no other sign of awareness. The stillness of his body was not rest. It was the final slowing, the point at which the body begins to release what it can no longer hold. Daniel entered quietly, his steps light on the worn floor. He met Leah's eyes and did not speak. There was nothing to say that the air in the room did not already hold. She shifted her position slightly, cradling Sorrow's head so that it rested in the bend of her arm. His eyes opened once, just enough to reveal the dull amber inside, then closed again without tension. His breathing came as a faint, irregular flutter, and she counted each one, knowing there would not be many left to count. She whispered a few words, barely more than a breath, the kind of sound meant to be felt more than heard. Her voice was steady, each syllable carrying the same calm she had given him through the night. Sorrow's chest rose once more, then held, the pause longer this time. A final exhale followed, quiet and complete. Leah kept her hand on him, waiting for another movement, but none came. The stillness was different now, absolute, without the small signs of struggle that had marked the hours before. The heater's hum filled the silence for a moment, joined by the low rustle of wind outside. Daniel stepped forward and placed a hand briefly on Leah's shoulder, the contact as measured as every movement they had made since he was found. She adjusted the blanket, folding it over him with care, her hands steady even now. There was no rush, no break in the quiet. The work was done, and what remained was only to keep him held a little longer before letting him go. The wind outside shifted, brushing against the dry grass beyond the wall. Leah stayed seated, her arm still curved around the small, weightless body, her gaze resting on the shape of him beneath the blanket. The sound of the wind rose once more, then settled again, carrying through the room as the first hint of pale light touched the far wall. The first light of day reached the compound in muted shades, casting a pale gold over the quiet yard. Leah stepped outside with Sorrow wrapped in the same fleece that had kept him warm through the night. His weight in her arms was lighter now, no longer shifting with the faint movements of breath. The air was still cool, carrying the dry scent of the open land, and the ground beneath her boots was firm from the night's settling dew. She walked slowly toward the stand of acacia trees beyond the fence, their thorned branches lifting against the early light. Each step was measured, not from reluctance but from the care she carried in the small, unmoving form. Daniel had gone ahead to choose a place where the roots would not be disturbed. A shallow rise in the earth where the grass thinned to bare soil. He waited there, the handle of the spade resting against his leg, the earth already loosened in a small, neat space. Neither spoke as Leah knelt, setting the fleece down for a moment so she could fold it more tightly around Sorrow, tucking the corners in as if the wind might touch him. The box he had been found in lay nearby, its sides warped and stained, a shape too small to belong to the open land it now sat upon. They lowered him into the earth together, the blanket keeping his body as it had been in life, a final measure of warmth in the cool morning. The sound of soil falling was soft, each layer settling gently over him until the ground was level once more. Leah pressed her palm to the earth for a moment, the skin of her hand warmed by the sun now beginning to rise. She lifted the box and set it beside the grave, its frail sides leaning in on themselves, no longer containing anything but the memory of where he had been found. The risks they had spoken of so often were behind them now. The decisions, the careful measures, the steady hours of watching, all had ended here, under the shade of the acacias. Leah stepped back, her gaze moving across the open plain where the light was strengthening, touching the tops of the grasses in long, narrow bands. The wind shifted through the trees, carrying with it the faint rustle of leaves and the smell of the warming earth. She stood there a moment longer, watching the horizon. In the stillness, there was no weight of failure, only the quiet knowledge that his short life had been seen, cared for, and carried to its end with dignity. The wind moved again, bending the grass in slow, even waves, and the sound of it lingered as the sun climbed higher into the day.